Napoleon Bonaparte. You know the name. He was one of the greatest military minds in all of history, a guy who literally redrew the map of Europe. But here's the question that's fascinated people for centuries. How did an emperor, at the absolute peak of his power, manage to engineer his own spectacular downfall? All right, let's get into it. You know, for years, Napoleon played the game of European politics and war like a chess grandmaster. He was always thinking 5, 6, 7 moves ahead of everyone else. But that same ambition, that drive to win, would lead him to make 3 catastrophic blunders, 3 fatal moves that would trap his king and bring the entire empire tumbling down.
So picture this. Napoleon is at the absolute height of his power. He controls most of Europe, but he's consumed by this one single anxiety. And it's not about a new enemy or some upcoming battle. No, it was all about the future. What happens to his great empire after he's gone?
To secure his legacy, he made a really personal and pretty cold calculation. He divorced his wife Josephine because she couldn't give him a child. He then married Marie-Louise, an Austrian archduchess, and sure enough, in 1811, she gave him a son, Napoleon II. So he had his heir. But this obsession with his dynasty, it was a sign of the incredible pressure he was putting on himself and on his empire.
Napoleon's relentless ambition. I mean, that was the engine of his success, right? But the problem was, it had no off switch. And that exact same drive for more power, more land, more control would soon become the very thing that would bring him to ruin.
And this quote, it just hits the nail on the head. It really gets to the heart of his whole story. His greatest strength, that insatiable hunger for power, was also his fatal flaw. It's what made him a legend, yeah, but it's also what made him so incredibly reckless. When you look back, historians pretty much all point to 3 huge mistakes that led directly to his collapse. First, this big economic gamble called the Continental System. Second, a brutal draining war known as the Peninsular War. And third, the one you've probably heard about, the catastrophic invasion of Russia. Let's break them down, one by one.
Okay, mistake number 1. Napoleon knew he couldn't defeat Britain's incredible navy. So he thought, okay, if I can't beat them at sea, I'll beat them with economics. In 1806, he ordered this massive blockade, closing off every port he controlled to any British goods. The idea was to make Europe totally self-sufficient and to basically choke Britain's economy to death. A bold plan for sure, but it was about to backfire spectacularly.
So why did it fall apart? Well, for starters, it was just impossible to enforce. You had smugglers having an absolute field day, and even Napoleon's own family and allies were secretly ignoring the whole thing. And then, to make matters so much worse, Britain's Royal Navy just flipped the script and set up its own blockade against France, which was way more effective. In the end, the system hurt Napoleon's empire far more than it ever hurt Britain.
And that brings us right to mistake number 2. See, to try and enforce that failing blockade, Napoleon decided to invade Spain to get Portugal to fall in line. He thought it would be a quick, easy victory. Instead, it turned into an absolute nightmare that cost him 300,000 soldiers. This wasn't just a war. It was like a bleeding wound that would just drain his empire of men and money for years.
Napoleon's army was the best in the world at traditional pitched battles, but they had absolutely no answer for the Spanish guerrillas. The word literally means little war. And these weren't soldiers in uniform. They were peasant fighters, farmers, everyday people who used hit and run tactics, ambushes, sabotage. This brutal, messy conflict not only tied down his best troops, but it also lit a fire under other conquered nations, inspiring them to start fighting back against French rule.
And that leads us to the third and most famous and most fatal mistake. This was truly the point of no return. Napoleon was furious that his supposed ally, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, was still trading with Britain. So Napoleon made the fateful decision to teach him a lesson by invading Russia. I mean, just look at that number. In 1812, Napoleon put together the largest European army ever seen up to that point, his Grand Armée, and he marched 420,000 soldiers toward Moscow. This was a force designed to completely shock and awe the Tsar into giving up.
But the Russians, they refused to play his game. Instead of facing him in one big, glorious battle, they just kept retreating deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia. And as they went, they burned everything, crops, villages, you name it. This was the scorched earth policy. And just like that, Napoleon's huge army, his greatest strength, became his biggest liability. It was a starving giant in a barren wasteland.
So Napoleon takes Moscow only to find it abandoned and on fire. He waited for weeks for the Tsar to surrender, but the surrender never came. As October rolled in, he realized he had no choice but to retreat, and that is when the legendary Russian winter came for them. His men faced starvation, frostbite, disease, and constant raids from the Russian army nipping at their heels.
Of the more than 420,000 men who marched into Russia with him, only about 10,000 staggered back out. Let that sink in. It was a catastrophe on a scale that's hard to even imagine. The Grande Armée was gone, and Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered for good.
Seeing Napoleon this week, all of his enemies finally saw their chance. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, even his former ally Austria, they all formed a grand coalition against him. For the very first time, pretty much all of Europe was united with a single goal: bring down Napoleon.
After Russia, the end came fast. He was crushed at the massive Battle of the Nations in 1813. By April 1814, Paris itself had fallen. Napoleon was forced to surrender and was sent into exile on the tiny island of Elba. But Napoleon was not done yet. In March of 1815, in one of history's greatest comebacks, he escaped, landed in France, and raised another army, kicking off the famous period we call the 100 Days.
The rest of Europe was stunned, but they moved quickly. They scrambled their forces and gathered in Belgium, near a little village called Waterloo. This was it, the final showdown. One last roll of the dice for Napoleon.
On June 18, 1815, Napoleon threw his new army against the British, led by the Duke of Wellington. The British lines bent and they buckled, but they never broke. They held on all day, just desperately waiting for help. And then, late in the afternoon, the Prussian army finally arrived and smashed into Napoleon's flank. His exhausted and inexperienced troops were just overwhelmed. The battle turned into a total rout.
And the defeat at Waterloo, it was absolute. The 100 Days were over. And with them, the Napoleonic era came to a final, crashing end. This time, there would be no second comebacks.
This time, his enemies took no chances. They exiled him to St. Helena, this remote, wind-swept rock in the middle of nowhere in the South Atlantic. And it was here that the former master of Europe would spend his last 6 years, writing his memoirs, reflecting on his unbelievable life, before finally dying in 1821.
The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville might have summed him up best. He was as great as a man can be without virtue. And that just captures it perfectly, doesn't it? This man of immense, world-changing genius, whose ambition wasn't tied to any kind of moral compass, an ambition that led to the deaths of millions. So in the end, who was he? Was he a brilliant strategist who spread the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe? Or was he just a power-hungry tyrant who plunged an entire continent into nearly constant war? The truth, as it usually is messy and complicated. And it leaves us with a question that people are still arguing about to this very day.